Good morning, Mahmud.
How are you, dear?
I am coming in good spirits this morning. Very much looking forward to talking to you again and exploring this theme. Um, and enjoying the weather warming up slightly and looking forward to going for a walk this afternoon.
Wonderful. Very good. And I'm finishing my coffee with you, don't mind.
That sounds like an excellent thing to be doing at this time of the morning.
No, I have not prepared a presentation,
Perfect.
so
No
so
presentation needed.
it will be a conversation, and I'm happy to take for the time being some loose points that I believe will contribute to general understanding. How you are going to edit this is your problem. Even though I will try to be a little bit systematic. But a few points. Actually, it's so relevant. I didn't think of it before. You know, uh, our call to examine the implications of the revelation of Baha'u'llah for economic life is intended to reach Baha'i institutions and communities, but is more directly, is directed most especially to the individual believer. If a new model of community life patterned on the teachings is to emerge, must not the company of the faithful demonstrate in their own lives the rectitude of conduct that is one of its most distinguishing features? Every choice a Baha'i makes, as employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary, you notice that in these four pairs, 8 billion human beings are included.
Yes.
Nobody is out of these four categories of points. Every choice a Baha'i makes leaves a trace, and the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims. Naturally, the friends habitually look to the teachings to set the standard to which to aspire. But the community, okay, let me go here because we don't want to read all of it. Not content with whatever values prevail in the existing order that surrounds them, the friends everywhere should consider the application of the teachings to their lives, and using the opportunities their circumstances offer them, make their own individual and collective contributions to economic justice and social progress wherever they reside. And this beautiful last sentence, such efforts will add to a growing storehouse of knowledge in this regard. But for me, this is one of the most eye-opening things in the field of economics that made me understand the whole concept of, we don't have a Baha'i economy. We know very clearly, the Guardian has said it, but we have principles that guide us in the discovery of new realities in economy. And this message was extremely detailed and clear, not by giving the answers, but by telling us the process.
Yes.
So what I understand from this, and I'm sure there are thousands of ways of understanding it, but what I feel from this is that one of the things that is going to happen for the future, or is happening now, is that we will not have a financial or economic system that will be written and drawn up behind closed doors by very smart people, which in the past have been usually men with white shirts, ties, and who have a white complexion.
Mm.
Some of them sitting in Washington or a place like that. I
Yes.
believe, therefore, that to a great extent, not exclusively, but to a great extent, the economic reality of tomorrow will be the fruit of our individual works now.
Mm.
Hence the necessity to talk about them, because they are not preset. We are creating it. Or as somebody said, we are building a plane while flying it.
But what you're saying, Mahmoud, is absolutely spot on for what my work has been for the past 20 years,
Mhm.
is this recognition, if I understand you correctly, that whilst there is no single Baha'i economy, you have very effective and very useful Baha'i principles.
Mhm.
And whenever anybody is working in the economy, and we're all working in the economy, whether we're a consumer or a producer, whether we're a borrower or a lender or any of that, we're all engaged in the economy.
Mhm.
Every single one of our choices shapes the economy that emerges as an
Mhm.
8 billion emergent collective property out of the individual actions of every single one of us. And in order to have the economy that we want to have, we need to be very aware of the decisions, the choices we're making as we engage in the economy. And that's a perfect lead up, if I've understood correctly, the essence of what you're pointing at. The My starting point was saying, okay, I've now spent a lot of time amongst people who are very anchored in their values.
Mhm.
And I remember very clearly one of the words at an EBABF conference when it was still in the Netherlands,
Mhm.
the September conferences in the Netherlands at De Poort,
Mhm. Mhm.
the words of Beppe Robiato, his definition of spirituality is love in action.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
for me, I think of myself as a spiritual atheist.
Mhm.
I firmly recognize the value of spirituality, but the concept of a God as it's typically presented is not something that I buy into. And so his words enabled me to bring together these two aspects of myself. Okay, if
Mhm.
spirituality is love in action, then I
Mhm.
know how to look at spirituality without without requiring me to believe in a specific concept of a God.
Mhm.
And so then, you know, after having spent a lot of time in values-oriented worlds, it became more and more clear to me, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, that how people actually behave, the decisions that we actually take, the values that we have are often unable to deliver the behaviors we need if the structures that we're embedded in are contrary or drive a contrary behavior. And so I realized that if we're truly going to have an economy that aligns with the values that we have, and whichever set of values somebody's working from, I would distill it down. If we have an economy where everybody eats, yeah, that's the simplest way I would put it. It's an
Mhm.
economy where
Mhm.
everybody eats, nobody
Mhm.
is systemically disadvantaged or advantaged.
Mhm.
To have that kind of economy, we need to make sure that things like how we incorporate companies, how we govern companies, how
Mhm.
we, the structures and structured interactions. And I
Mhm.
distinguish between a static structure and a dynamic interaction that has a predefined structure.
Mhm.
Those have to be set up in such a way that the behaviors that the structures and structured interactions are designed to deliver are the same behaviors that the values are oriented towards delivering. And if there's a clash, the values are trying to deliver these behaviors, but the structures are trying to deliver these behaviors, then all we end up doing is tearing people apart. We have the fear and the aspirations of, let's say, the material body trying to go one way, and the values the spiritual body trying to go another way, and it tears people apart. It leads to something that you might call schizophrenic ways of engaging. Yeah, and so that's really been, my work, and why I wanted to have this conversation. So you've set it up perfectly for the conversation by reading that to me, is that in my work, I have been very guided by, first of all, that quote of Beppe. Okay, if spirituality is love in action, what will lead to the most aligned action, aligned
Mm,
across all of the things that shape my actions? And then the various Baha'i values I've also found very helpful in thinking through what kinds of behaviors will lead to an economy that works for all life on the planet, an
mm,
economy where everybody eats.
mm.
And so that's where I was thinking, well, a conversation between us would be worth recording and could well be useful for a lot of people if you can speak to the Baha'i principles and the various documents, examples that you just shared from the House of Justice, and then we can then go into a dialogue about, well, if that's the principle, how effectively is that principle expressed in the way we incorporate today, the way we invest today,
Mm.
and how else could we incorporate, how else could we invest in order to better express it?
You see, yes, based on, in addition to this individual responsibility that we just read about, there is a need for structure. I think that very same text tells us that that structure can only be experience-based and not theory-based. At least it's my belief. In other words, I don't believe that some people are going to sit down again and say, based on the best knowledge we have, theoretically, this is the structure we need for our central banks, for the way interest rates are going to be set, for the way economy tariffs will be applied or not, whatever. I don't think we will get there. I think the real new structure will emerge, and that is the sentence that says, such efforts will add to a growing storehouse of knowledge in this regard. The storehouse of knowledge about individual and collective behavior will have to come from experience. Now, the experience of the individual is when I decide to buy something or not. The individual of the collectivity, this experience of the collectivity for creating the structure will come also while applying certain principles in unity. You can sit down and say, this structure did work or didn't work, and for this reason. I don't believe we can find somewhere a magical structure that will generate miracles. Because the only structure that works is the structure that sits deeply in the hearts of people. And therefore, it is not a mental construct. It is love, as Beppe has said. The other thing that I think is very important, and it again comes from this text, but based on just one word of that text, we've had several gatherings in different communities with Baha'i friends and others, the concept of coherence. Again, I read that sentence that says, every choice we make leaves a trace, and the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's action to fulfill those aims. Now, reflecting on coherence is a fundamental thing. What is coherence? Okay? When we were reissuing our 7 core values in EBBF about 10, 12 years ago, we picked the values at a board meeting, a very long board meeting. So these are the 7, and we're going to work on them before we announce them. And for each one of those values, we looked at a few quotes, which you can find on our website. If you want, you go to the EBBF website, you look at the 7 core values, and there is a document behind it to explain each one of them.
Mm.
Mostly quotes from the Baha'i writings. And the one that and each one was moderated by one of the board members to have online conversations before we got to Portugal to discuss the whole thing. You may have been there because this was done in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, in Portugal. Now, or sorry, in Barcelona, I guess. Anyhow, doesn't matter. I was responsible for moderation with the EBBF core value of moderation. I looked at all the writings I could, obviously limited in my capacity, limited in my time, and all of that. I saw a lot of quotes on the importance of moderation, but nothing about what moderation itself is. Then I looked outside, and all references to moderation is a question of being between 2 extremes. Then the question is, what is the extreme? And the answer is something that is not moderate. So you have a funny situation, of defining moderation. Until I realized, at that time, we did not put it in writing this way. What we said at that time, moderation is contextual. Moderation varies in time, varies in circumstances. And what I discovered afterwards, personally, was a very nice example of what moderation is. In Colombia, after 60 years of fighting between the country and the war and the FARC, the government decided to go through a process of negotiation to end the war. Their fundamental aim was peace. They reached an agreement, signed it, but then they had to put it to referendum. The people rejected it. The fundamental value that the people were looking for was justice, not peace. They did not want justice at any rate. They did not want peace at any rate. They wanted the right combination of peace and justice, which led me to understand that values may be absolute in their definition, but they are relative in their application. So we cannot sit and just say, from my translation of that concept in economy, it is not fair to X, Y, or Z. It could be, even that thing could be fair, given the circumstances. And I think to some extent, economy has it. Value is relative. A liter of water costs 50 cents in the middle of a city where you can buy it anywhere, and it's worth $20 million if you are in the middle of a desert and you need it absolutely for your survival, and you have the $20 million. So what is the value? We're talking now about monetary value, but the same concept is applicable to spiritual value. So if we understand that there is a need for coherence among those values, the first thing we will do is to move away from polarization, because polarization is all about giving 100% value to something. For example, right now, 100% importance has been given to making $2 trillion of savings on the American budget. The overriding value is $2 trillion of savings. In the process, a lot of other things will be sacrificed. The other thing that this brings to the other reflection that comes to me is that if things, therefore, are not clear in advance, what is the Baha'i way or answer to defining them. And when I do it when I have the possibility of doing it on a little piece of paper, I draw two things. Let me see whether I can do it now. Very bad drawings, but let me see what you see. Do you see this thing? What does it remind
Yes,
you of?
I see a scale, or like
Wonderful.
the
Scale.
scales of justice.
Okay, very good. And what do you see here?
I see 3 candles.
Okay, that was bad drawing. I see them as weights.
Okay, 3 weights. Right, perfect.
Okay, 3 or more. So I believe that the Baha'i answer to how you find coherence is those two concepts. You need a scale in order to be able to weigh things, and that is the principle of consultation. Which means everything needs to be put to that examination, and there is no preset balance. You have to create it. And the second thing is that based on what criteria, which the weights are, will you determine that this is the correct weight? If you want 1 kilo of rice, then you must have a definition of what 1 kilo is.
Hmm.
And those are the values or principles. So if somebody asks me, what is the Baha'i answer to the concept of coherence? I say 2 things. A process, which is consulting. Now, you will find books and books on consultation the way Baha'is understand it. But as a principle, as a concept, is easy. Consultation. Bringing in differing opinions with respect, but frankness, etc., etc. I won't go into Baha'i consultation. We had a whole EBBF session on consultation. It was in Milan. And then the second thing is, what are those values? Justice, etc. But not only values that people frequently mention. The nobility of human being is probably the foremost value. Whether it's peace or development that you want to talk about, the fundamental thing you have to agree on before that is to accept the inherent nobility of human beings. Because, and this is what I am adding, if you believe that human beings are not noble, the world we have now is the best we deserve. Finished. If after you hear about greed in a company, you say, after all, it's human nature, then you deserve more greed. If every time you hear about a war, you say, after all, there has always been wars and human beings are aggressive, etc., then what are you complaining about? But then when it comes to application, well, but governments are greedy. Americans are greedy. Musk is greedy. Trump is greedy. Forget about that. Are you greedy?
Yes.
And if you believe you can do it, then others should be able to do it too.
Exactly.
So this concept of how do we define the human nature becomes fundamental in the solution to all problems. Because if we build it on wrong premises, we will go wrong. Graham, please stop me. I get excited and then I just go in all directions. Huh? But I have a clear example of that, which to some extent explains also the polarization. Back in the 18th century, when we had new democracies created, the whole system that was put in place had fundamentally one concept at its root. distrust. We did not trust the king, and we decided to take away all his powers, divide it into three, and make those three fight one another: legislative, executive, and judiciary. We were very express about it. The balance of powers was the very foundation of democracy. So the world we have is the system that we have in our political system, which also has influenced the market concept, is based on lack of trust.
Mm.
I don't trust the ruler. I must put checks and balances. I don't trust the market. I have to do this and that. On one hand, we make it free. On the other hand, we have to look at what sorts of limitations we can put on it, or etc. What sort of structure? Well, no doubt that this, after 2 centuries, not responding to the needs of the world anymore.
Mm.
Simple. Something based on lack of trust will not generate trust. Punto. So our new realities should be based on a different way, a different approach. This is written in 1931 by the guardian of the Baha'i faith. If long-cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formula have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of a continually evolving humanity, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. Why should these, in a world subject to the immutable law of change and decay, be exempt from the deterioration that must needs overtake every human institution? For legal standards, political and economic theories are solely designed to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole, and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine.
Yes.
Nation state is in that category.
Mm-hmm.
Lack of trust in the authority is in that category. The definition of power as domination rather than cooperation is in that category. So we must have a clear idea of these things. Trust, if the most important book of Soul.com, if you remember, is a 2-day course on trust.
Mm.
We've had tens of thousands of people go through that course because it's the foundation for transformation.
Let me
Yes.
respond to what you've been saying, because you've set things up perfectly. Everything that you've been saying is very much aligned with what I've been working from for nearly 2 decades, and is behind the way that we've been incorporating companies now for over 10 years, and the way that we're working towards changing the investment paradigm towards investing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if I think, if I start with what you've just said, the legal standards, political and economic theories, they've come out of the past. They were workable solutions when they were first formulated, but that doesn't mean that they are the solutions that we have to still follow today. And I have conversations with economists where we talk about neoclassical economics as a religion, as a dogma, rather than as a science, because it is very much, it's a dogma. And I'll unpack that a bit in a moment. But one of the things you've said which really lands with me is the topmost value, the nobility of the human being. And if we start with that topmost value of the nobility of the human being, and as you say, recognizing that the current set of institutions we have, and I use institution to mean a body of agreements rather
Mhm.
than the
Mhm.
United Nations as an
Yeah.
institution.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the institutions we have of business across much of society and so on, as you say, they're based on distrust, they're based on separation rather than unity.
Mm-hmm.
And the bit that I'll add in, you were speaking earlier about the process and the values.
Mm-hmm.
The process that we have at the moment today is a process of adversarial debate, which is the worst possible way of getting to unity, a unity that respects and recognizes diversity of uniqueness. And you spoke at the beginning about the necessity of anchoring in experience rather than theory that is detached from experience. And it's now almost 15 years ago that I was really asking myself, why is it that companies behave the way they do? And yeah, I'll go sideways for a moment. When I think of a company, I went back to the original Latin origin of the word company. It's from the Latin cum panis, with bread. And basically, a company is an intentional community. And if you look at the writings of Peter Drucker, he said, you form a company when you have a challenge that you're trying to address that is bigger than any one person can ever address. And so I think of a company as an intentional community of people. And then I was asking myself, well, why is it that despite the fact that a company is well looked at as an intentional community of people, in other words, it's a collective of human beings. And if we have the nobility of the individual human being as a topmost value, then the nobility of an intentional community of human beings is an expression of that topmost value.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was asking myself, why is it two things? First of all, we treat companies as the property of the investors. We talk about ownership of companies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's despite the fact that in law, when you incorporate a company, it's allocated legal personhood just as any human being is.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the nation state. That's the third category of legal personhood. And the
Mm-hmm.
fourth category now are things like valleys, rivers, mountains that are given legal personhood. And in all of these, it's clear, you know, you and I as human beings, we exist in two levels. We exist at the flesh and blood level, but what gives us the right to sign contracts is our legal avatar that exists
Mm-hmm.
at the legal level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a shareholder agreement in law is actually a contract between two persons, one of them the investing person, the other one the investee person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was asking myself, why is it that we treat companies as the property of investors when actually in law, the company isn't really the property? That's an interpretation that we've put in through our institutions. So I was asking myself why. And I'll say something about why, and then I'll come back to that. How should we look at a company? And I realized I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And regardless of what somebody's values were, we were all embedded in a governance structure that divided, and a governance structure that said, if you had a white skin, only then did you have the right to vote. Only then did you have some fraction of control of the country and some fraction of control of the wealth generated. And I realized the way we incorporate companies, either you are lucky enough to have money to invest, or in a cooperative, you're lucky enough to have an employment contract. Only then do you get the right to vote. Then you have control of the company. Then you have control of the wealth generated. And I realized that there's a common pattern, an apartheid-like pattern, between how South Africa was governed in a way that excluded all of the other stakeholders, the citizens of the country, from governance, except for those with a white skin. And the way we incorporate excludes all of the other people that are part of the company's operations. It denies them. It refuses to recognize their nobility. It's based on distrust rather than trust. And so we then used existing company law, and we've been running companies this way, building companies this way around the world for a decade now, where we said, okay, let us truly recognize that all of the different capitals and stakeholders that are affected by a company's operation have an inherent nobility, and unless they demonstrate through their actions and behaviors that they are not yet ready to engage, to include them in the annual general meeting with voting rights. And so we now have mechanisms that allocate voting rights to, for example, a representative steward for the next 7 generations, a representative steward for nature, and direct voting rights, of course, for investors. Financial capital needs to be represented. And there are then voting rights for the staff, because they're investing human capital. Independent of how they're actually remunerated, they're investing human capital. We have voting rights. For instance, in a typical company, we might allocate voting rights to certain customers, to certain suppliers, those with a really strong long-term relationship with the company, not those with just a simple transactional relationship. And by doing this, what we build up, very much to your drawing of the scales and the weights, it anchors in, using existing law to protect that anchoring, a process of consultation across everybody that's affected by the decision. And we do internally, the actual decisions are not taken by brute force, simple voting, yes, no, but more, yes, I agree, I have concerns, but it's not too dangerous to try. And no, I veto it. It's too dangerous to even try once. Where then there is a dialogue process that everybody who vetoes it explains what they're seeing that makes it too dangerous to even try once. And then through dialogue, either they reach a point where they realize, actually, I wasn't seeing what makes it safe, or everybody else realizes, oh, I wasn't seeing what makes it too dangerous, to the point where everybody either agrees or says, I can live with it. And once we get to that point, then we move forwards. And so once I'd understood that and we experimented with it, put it into practice, one of the 2 things I'll still mention. One of them is, in addition to everybody involved in governance, with an appropriate weighting.
Mm.
One of the things that's built in, you don't want to be in a situation where the opinion with the most people dominates the opinion with fewer people. So there are balances that, more like deep democracy, if you're familiar with that, that all opinions' voice can be heard and is sufficiently respected to not swamp somebody else's, nor is the opinion with the most money dominant. And those are the two ways of governing companies at the moment. The standard limited is the opinion with the most money wins, and the standard cooperative, the opinion with the most people wins. So we have that built in. Also, the things like dividends, capital gain, we recognize that the growth in the financial value of a company is invariably coming from a multiplicity of capitals being invested. And so human capital, intellectual capital, all of those capitals, natural capital, shares in some of the value generated financially as well. So this addresses what you were saying earlier. It's a way of delivering prosperity of humankind. It's structurally, systemically counteracting the way current limited companies are structured, that all of the wealth goes towards the financial investors, or not all, but the bulk of it goes that way. But then the last thing I want to put in is this then comes back to my starting question, which was, what is a company? And if I look at a company as a collective being, an intentional community, then this makes clear that by including all voices with an appropriate process and appropriate values, where that all recognizes the inherent nobility of the human being and of the collective being, that then makes it very easy to recognize that you can no more think of owning a collective being as you can think of owning an individual human being, and that the and that then brings what is actually written in company law, that a incorporated legal entity has the full powers of an individual. That brings what is written in law and what is written in many legal judgments interpreting what the law says, that brings how we actually put it into practice, because of the structures we're embedded in. The governance structures we're embedded in are not comporting well with the nobility of the human being and the actual wording of the law. And so that's one of the key things that we've been doing over the past 10 years. And it's beginning to gain more and more traction now with people who are building consciousness-oriented companies, trust-oriented companies, and they're recognizing the weakness in practice of the old structures, the old legal standards, and not so much the legal standard itself, but the way that we're implementing it in structures. I'll pause there.
Wow. When I take notes, and I take lots of notes, they
Wow.
they are in different colors, and the ones in red are either things that I need to do or things that I need to respond to, but I won't, because this is not responding. Let's, because there are many things. Of course, you're aware of B Corp, right?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about the way you are going about what you're doing. You said you've been doing it for 10 years. How has that experience been? What type of companies did you create? For example, I'm very interested in understanding when you say in the voting rights, some customers, some suppliers, etc. What is the criteria based on which you decide which customers get a vote and which don't? A little bit, because if this thing is going to be useful for others, then it is the sharing of the experience of concrete things that will make a big difference. And just to tell you one experience of my own, with some friends, actually we have invested in a real estate company, and we set the system among ourselves, which shows to some extent also the fact that not everything needs a different structure. Basically, we said in our shareholder agreement that every investor gets one vote, irrespective of the amount of money they have put in. So people with 20% of the shares of the company have the same say as those who have 2%.
Mm.
And then we ask ourselves, I mean, what is the assumption behind the fact that if you put more money, you need to have more of a say? On one hand, you say you're contributing more, well, yes, but on the other hand, if you are a minority investor, you can get more badly affected by the decisions of the majority. So what is it that we want to promote in the assignment of votes? So I totally agree and see the direction in which you've been going, but tell me a little bit more about it, because it's again, I don't want to go to my red notes because there's so many things to say. Tell me a little bit more about your experience, and specifically, what activities have you done, and how do you think that experience can be shared in a way that is not a formula, but a process?
Yes. So, first of all, the way to think about this is it's a design language for forming and governing legal entities. It's not a single thing. It's not a predefined thing. It's a set of questions and patterns that are centered around values like the overall nobility of human beings. And so in that sense, one of the things in terms of voting rights, we're just the same as your real estate operation. It's one person, one vote, not €1, one vote, or
Yes.
something like that.
Hmm.
And then to the criteria for voting, one of the principles behind this way of incorporating, we call it the FairShares Commons, because it's a fair share of governance across all stakeholders and a fair share of wealth generated. And it's using existing company law to include what actually works from Eleanor Ostrom's studies of a highly functioning commons. Not an open commons where everybody can come in, but a closed commons, the traditional way that communities have managed resources from pretty much the beginning of humanity's existence. And so, to your question of voting rights, one core principle is the separation of past and future. And so the criterion for voting is that you have a strong relationship with the future of the company. Whereas the criterion for wealth share is your relationship in the past up to now. So if you've invested money 10 years ago, that qualifies you for dividends and capital gain, because what we've achieved now in wealth generation is because of that investment. But it doesn't necessarily qualify you for voting rights in the future. If you say, well, actually, I qualify for dividend rights, but I have every intention of selling my shares to the highest bidder tomorrow. yeah, I have no further interest in the company. That might mean that you ought not to be involved in voting on the future of the company. Similarly, if I think of one of my clients right now, he's setting up a let's say, let me call it a real estate project in Indonesia. He's buying land, putting buildings up for people who want to live in an intentional community that is centered on addressing global challenges around climate change, resource degradation, things like that. And so the central question we're going through to define the criteria to be allowed to have voting power is how strong is that individual or company's relationship with the long-term future of the company? Are they in the same relationship with the company that a parent is towards the child? Then they definitely qualify for voting rights. Or is their relationship more the relationship of, I don't know, a gelato, say, shop in the center of the city where you're there as a tourist, you're only ever going to buy one gelato from this person, you'll never see them again. Well, then they do not qualify for voting rights. And so in this case, one of the stakeholder groups is the local village of Indonesian people that have always lived in that territory. And these people will be allocated, we're working through the numbers now, but they will get somewhere between 3 and maybe up to 10% of the voting rights in the company. And they qualify for a share of the dividends and a share of the capital gain because it recognizes that they are the old stewards of that land, the old stewards of that environment, and they will still be there and having to live with the consequences of whatever is done long after this company may have gone bankrupt or may have had to shut down or whatever. And so they qualify for voting rights. Equally, the investors qualify for voting rights. The inhabitants of the village, regardless of whether they are renting or buying, will qualify for voting rights because they're inhabitants living there, but they only qualify after they've been resident for, say, 12 months already, and so long as their residency contract is set to run for at least another 12 months. So again, there's evidence. Yes.
Go ahead.
Right. Excellent. So the residents have voting rights. The staff get voting rights after they've been with the company for at least 6 months and with every intention of staying longer. And strategic long-term suppliers, where there's a supplier relationship that will extend indefinitely into the future, they get a proportion of voting rights as well. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how it's structured. And to the question of, so over the past years, we've worked with startups in the, one startup we've worked with is in the mining sector in Canada, and they're building a startup with around pumps, motors, hard technology. And with them, we've got to the point of they're moving towards incorporation. We've already worked with the Quebec government on this, on really working it through. One of the early companies that used this and they shut down for financial reasons a few years later was around 2016. They incorporated in Delaware, and this was a peer-to-peer sharing company.
Mm-hmm.
There's a company in Ireland that started up around music. It was going to be a competitor to Spotify, but one where the musicians had much more financial benefit and much better engagement in governance.
Yeah.
And then at the other end, so one of the companies that we've worked with in London, they didn't go all the way, but were very much inspired by this. They actually listed on the Viennese Stock Exchange about 7 years ago. And another company, again, very much inspired by this, is a media company aimed at the African diaspora. And so they're also working this way.
I'm listening. Continue. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
So also working this way. And then we have clients at the moment in Costa Rica. Again, it's a regenerative land-based project that's working this way. So let's say quite a few different companies in different fields, but what unites all of them is a desire to build a new kind of economic paradigm and a recognition. So for example, one company we're talking to right now, the recognition is that none of the other ways of incorporating, building, and running companies that they've looked at are good enough at expressing the values they want to express. And if I compare it to the B Corp, I'll distinguish here between the B Corp as a certification process versus the public benefit company as a way of incorporating.
Mm-hmm.
As I look at it, the B Corp certification is having the values without the scales.
Mm.
It's a certification, but if somebody comes along, let's say a private equity company buys out all of the investors and the PE house says, well, I don't care about the certification. I just want to extract as much money as I can in the next 12 months. The certification has no power to defend itself. And then I looked at the public benefit corporation.
Just one thing. Certification in itself, no power, but those who are the owners of those shares have the power, right, of not selling.
They have the power of not selling, but if they do sell,
Mm.
then there's no further, it's let's say it's very dependent on a few individuals who have power because of the money they invested.
Mm.
Whereas in this approach, it's all of the people who would be affected by selling who have the power to engage in that. And that means that the certification can now be defended by all of the people who are affected if that certification drops, not just the investors. And so that's let's say the step change. It works perfectly with a B Corp certification, and it really is about my questioning, how can we shift from this a polarized system of distrust into
Mm.
one where we bring into the consultation process that leads to a vote in the shareholder meeting, bring into that on an equal footing or eye to eye all
Mm.
of the different stakeholders that will either be beneficially or
Yeah,
detrimentally affected by a decision.
totally. Well, you also know the example of Ben and Jerry's, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they wanted to sell to the private equity, they drafted a 95-page contract to make sure that the principles on which they were based will be respected by the new owner. Uh, Now, I don't know 10 years or 12 years later how exactly they stand there, but the guy who was there at that time is a member of EBBF who drafted the contract. And he explained to us once what they had done in order to make sure that those values continue. Uh, to be also a little bit more concrete about this, um, what do you think we can do with this and about this as EBBF?
Right. So in terms of what EBBF, what we can do with it, and to Ben and Jerry's, the difficulty with contracts is that they're still sitting inside the current institutions based on distrust and adversarial relationships. You know, one of the things I learned when I was working for Procter and Gamble is that contracts, patents, etc., are only as good as the amount of money you're willing to pay lawyers to defend them.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and so in that sense, this is about building in something which is not about trying to lock down and predict the future today.
Yes.
It's rather about let's be dynamic and adaptive to the future as it emerges and
Yeah.
center ourselves in an inclusive, consultative process
Right.
for governance decisions.
Yeah.
Um, and so in that sense, the where I think that this could be useful to the EBBF to EBBF members is in the sense that my intention in this is to look at what are the principles that lead to the kind of economy that we need, that lead to the kind of society we need. There's something else I haven't touched on yet that I should touch on, which is about wealth inequality.
Mhm.
What is it that will lead to that in terms of, as you know, is up here in front of me? What are the legal standards, political and economic theories that are no longer safeguarding human interest today?
Mhm.
And so my sense is that the FairShares Commons is at the very least a useful starting point to explore a very different way of structuring
Sorry, again.
this.
I understand the benefit of sharing that experience with people so that they can also go about it in their own endeavors because this is what we do. Share an interesting experience and see what each member does with it.
Hmm. Yes, exactly. And in particular, for members that really are wanting ways in business of expressing to the best possible extent the principles, the nobility of the human being,
Mhm.
this really goes beyond simply selling or not being able to sell the company into
Mhm.
something that builds in all of the necessary structures and structured interactions for people to truly be able to engage with each other in with the company as the mediator of their interactions in such a way that all of them can really express their nobility, that it's designed to as best possible enable the expression of the higher values rather than anything else.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Same time, what the point is that the point of departure for somebody who wants to do this is that there is existing trust. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it, right?
I I would I actually disagree with that and I
Okay,
agree
please.
with it.
Okay.
So where you say that there's existing trust, um, there does need to be some kind of trust to to come together and engage in incorporation in the first place. There does need to be some level of trust that incorporating in such a way that multiple stakeholders have governance power
Mhm.
is a wise thing to do.
Mhm.
Where I disagree um, is in the sense that if you go back to the origin of the joint stock company, it was formed back in the days you were pointing at when all of our institutions were being formed.
Mhm.
It was formed because there was a need for more capital than one single wealthy family could produce within the family, where the trust was on the basis of family blood tie
Yes.
relationships. And so actually the current joint stock company was designed as a way to create the outcomes of trust between investors that didn't trust each other. And in that sense, this doesn't actually require all of the stakeholders to have trust in each other as human beings. It's actually more designed to do the opposite for people who don't trust each other, where perhaps the different aspects that they represent are in some sense in opposition to each other, to come together in a governance process where you can get the outcomes of trust without necessarily requiring the trust.
Wait, I don't get it. How can I accept when I start an activity with someone else to go for one person, one vote if I've got 50% of the shares put in it, unless I trust the other ones? I would never accept one person, one vote if I'm the majority shareholder, if I don't trust the other ones. That's why I went into it, because I totally trusted the guy who said, would you like to come into a company like this? I said, yes. He said, can you help me? Actually, humbly, that happened. Can you help us design it in a way that is one person, one vote, if you agree with it? I said, yes, I agree. And then we sat down and we created the way it was created. And we put all the logic behind it. We said, if the small one is more affected by the other ones, maybe we should give him more of a vote. But no, let's say one vote per person, etc. So I think trust is a prerequisite for entering into such an agreement. The agreement will give structure to trust, but trust is needed. Otherwise, there is no way you can reach an agreement.
I agree with what you're saying there. There needs to be enough trust to
Yes.
enter into this agreement.
Yes.
If I take, though, you may know the book. Where is it? The book of Adam Kahane, Collaborating with the Enemy.
Yes.
And that's really what this structure is about. It's if there's enough trust to come into the governance process. So what I'm saying is this is a way, this sets up, it's sufficient if you trust that the scales and the weights are the best possible to get to values aligned outcomes. And that enables me, so long as I trust you enough to stay true to the process and the values, then I don't actually need to trust you as a person. That's the subtle distinction I'm making.
That's heavy. Say it again.
So long as I trust the process and the values, and I trust that you will follow the process and the values, I don't actually need to agree with you as a person or trust you as a person in the absence of those. It's a bit like, to take as an extreme example, if I want to buy a gelato from somebody in Brussels, I don't need to trust them as a person. They don't need to trust me as a person. We just need to trust that the money that I will exchange is trustworthy.
Because it's a transaction, it's not a relation. Among shareholders, you're talking about relations, not transaction.
Yes. So again, there though, relations are live and dynamic. Trust, at least some people, trust builds up over time. Other people, they start at 100% and trust degrades over time. And so what this does is let's say, for instance, you have investors representing financial capital and a local community representing natural capital. Those two communities at the beginning are, before they get to know each other at all, are quite likely to have high levels of distrust. With this way of structuring and governing a company, so long as each of them trusts that the governance process is trustworthy and that each party will stick to the governance process and not try to use military force to just take, then they can start working together. And over time, as they experience what it's like to be in a consultative governance process rather than a brute force power over governance process, so the trust between them will grow over time. And so I recognize what you're saying. It's a human relationship. There's a lot of trust that is needed for it to work really well. And I see this as a positive reinforcing virtuous spiral, that if there's enough trust to start, then the trust will continue to grow over time as they experience it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I would slightly change what Procter and Gamble used to say. A contract is as good as the amount of money that you're ready to pay your lawyers to go against. I think a contract is as good as the amount of trust that exists between contractors. Because if there is trust, there's no need to go to the courts nor to the lawyers. So,
Yes.
and I believe also, and I thank you for this conversation because it refines my own ideas. I learned a lot. I think right now I'm inclined to take to take the concept of trust, to move it away from being one of those weights to the very principle of scale. There cannot be a consultation if there is no trust. There can be a consultation if you don't have common values, you're going to look for it. But there cannot be a consultation if there is no trust, because you will not listen, you will not learn from it, and you cannot learn from your mistakes. So, at least conceptually in my mind, I came up with something I didn't think of before. Where would I put trust in those two? I'll put it as a foundational requirement for the scale to exist. So
Mhm.
once you have it there, then you put weights in order to actually, the purpose of weights is to allow getting balance in differing situation.
Mhm.
That's all a weight does. If you want to weigh an envelope because you want to know how much you have to put stamps on it, you need a very, very sensitive scale. Or you need a weight that goes by grams. And if you want to weigh an elephant, you need a scale that goes by hundreds of kilos, right? So those weighs depend on the reality that you're examining. But the fact that you have to trust the scale is there. Otherwise, no matter what weights you have, if you don't trust the scale, it's good for nothing. So conceptually, at least in my mind, I would like to say that take out of this conversation as one important thing, where would I place trust in that
Yes.
image?
What you're saying, Mahmoud, is spot on. Yeah, I do see trust as being a characteristic of the scale
Mm,
itself. I
yes,
see trust. So my father was a pharmacist, so he had very precision scales for measuring micrograms or milligrams of
right,
potent medicines. Yeah,
right,
he was of a generation where he actually manufactured medicines himself in his pharmacy, not just
ah,
selling pre-wrapped things.
right,
And so in what I'm saying, I am thinking of my what I'm trying to embody in this way of incorporating is trust as that very sharp point in the middle of the scale that the arms balance on.
Mm.
And that trust I see as a characteristic of the scale
Mm.
rather than the characteristic of two people in their relationship, or more accurately said, if two people are in relationship with each other in the context of a shareholder agreement, then the scale is that shareholder agreement and the dialogue processes and so on, rather than their human relationship with each other. There's the structured relationship rather than the human relationship. And in that sense, if I see trust as a characteristic of the scale, then it's something that each individual person only needs to have trust from their side to the scale and from their side to the scale. They don't need to build up the direct person-to-person trust before they can even begin. That can come as a consequence of getting to know each other, mediated by the scale. And I think that your insight is spot on, and I think that this is really central. You spoke earlier about context and coherence. So trust is not something, if I think of the two of us, trust lies in three different places. There's a trust that lies in you towards me. There's a trust that lies in me towards you. And then there's the trust that lies independently of those two in the relationship between us. And those three different contexts of trust or locations of trust shape each other. And if we have a trust between us that is very strong because the relationship location of trust is in the scales, then that will strengthen the trust that I perceive as I look at you, and will strengthen the trust that you perceive as you look at me.
Mm.
So I think that looking at trust as being dependent on context and looking at through the question of coherence across all of the different locations of trust, and then the question of how do we have institutions of trust in each location that reinforce the strength of the trust in all of the contexts.
You know, I saw Adam Kane in Dubai a couple of years ago, and because I communicated with him, he has invited me, I guess, with many thousands of other people, to have conversations for his second book.
Yes,
So are you involved in that?
I'm involved in that as well. Yes.
Yeah. So what you just said is interesting, but maybe adds another element of context. And that is, you see, he is talking about a process of mediation and bringing together people who hate one another, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it is understandable that in this context, the only thing they can trust is the process.
Mm-hmm.
The FARC and the Colombian government that he brought together at the same table hated one another. They didn't get in because there was trust. But I think this is a different context of conversations than the conversations about creating a company. If I don't individually trust a guy, I believe at this stage, at least of my understanding, I will never get in a company with them. No matter what process you are offering me, because I don't need to. You know, I've had several companies of my own. I've done, I don't know, several hundred, near 1,000 recruitment conversations. Okay.
Mm.
And for me, the most important point in a conversation when I wanted to recruit someone is that, can I trust them?
Mm-hmm.
Their technical, practical knowledge was secondary because it could always be learned. Trust cannot be learned. Okay? It can be gained, but not learned. And I didn't want that effort to be part of my work, because then you should look behind your shoulder all the time, and that's too expensive for you when you want to hire someone. You can build other types of capacity, but at least my idea was not, I don't need to build the trust capacity. I need to be trustworthy for the person once
Mm-hmm.
he or she is in the organization for this spiral to work. But it needed a beginning, a capital at the beginning, a seed capital.
Yes.
A seed capital of trust. So, on the other hand, and I'm open to the fact that all institutions that we have should be subject to change, including what I'm going to say. But in my studies of law, one of the things we knew is that a contract first happened in the minds of people, and its written expression is only a proof of an agreement between parties. So that's why you can have oral contracts that are as valid as any other contract, except for the burden of proof. So the fact that you put something in writing, if in the minds of people there is not agreement and trust, the written statement will be without value.
Mm.
So, and I can explain that well. We have it very clearly in the process of legislation. When in the 70s, most countries in the Western world started the legislation, adopted the legislation that you cannot hire a woman who is pregnant while she's working at the organization. Well, the purpose was very clear. You wanted to defend, to protect mothers and women, and because they were arriving into the workforce and their presence was required, etc. But because something that you put in paper is not enough, we could see very clearly that people started not to hire women at the age of bearing children because they didn't want the consequences. So the
Yes.
letter of the law did not do a lot. And as Montesquieu talks about the spirit of the laws, that spirit little by little worked, because people started to realize why at all we have created such legislation. So the mental model of we want to protect pregnancy went to a different mental model of we want to bring equality and fairness and justice to the society as a whole. So while absolutely the contracts are needed, because not in my best dreams of a perfect world would I imagine a world without any contracts. By the way, if we make a little digression there, in the Baha'i faith, everybody has the duty of writing their will. But if my heirs know exactly what I want, why do I have to write it? But because the fact of writing it gets you first to reflect on it, and then it keeps clarity. So again, the contract is not the generator of trust. It is something that generates clarity, which in itself brings trust. But if the content of the contract is not compelling enough to reflect what was agreed, then, well, I don't know what percentage, but well, actually, with contract law, every single litigation is based on a contract, which did not comply with its duty of generating trust within among the parties. Okay.
So we may well be pointing at the same larger territory where you may be emphasizing this and I'm emphasizing that. So, everything that you've said is true, and I recognize the value. If I take for a start what you said about contracts, absolutely, contracts agree in the minds of the people who contract in the first place. Now, there are two additional perspectives I'd like to add in. One of them is, let me call it inheritance. Somebody might have invested in a company with a shareholder agreement, and that person has a high level of trust with the company's founders and the other investors. And then that person passes away, and their estate inherits the contract, becomes the other party, and either the estate as a general collective body or a single person who inherits that contract may not be a trustworthy person. And even if they are, they may not have trust or be trusted. So that's one example of where the idea of the FairShares Commons is to put the emphasis on the governance process and how that functions, rather than something that was locked in place as a concretization of the trust at the point the first investment was made. The second complementary perspective I want to put in is, recall the FairShares Commons includes in governance rights a representative of the next 7 generations, a representative of nature, perhaps the indigenous community that the business is going to operate within. And all 3 of those, for various reasons, often have high levels of distrust initially. And this offers them a dynamic mechanism of saying, well, I don't trust investors because every time I've been involved with investors in the past, they've ended up taking natural resources and we've had very little in return and have had to deal with the fallout. But in this case, I'm willing to take the risk of engaging. I still don't trust the investors, but this is a different way of engaging with investors, and I'm willing to trust that the scales will lead to different outcomes versus how we've behaved in the past. And so I put those in as, this is the difference I'm trying to point at. This opens up possibilities for people to come into a contractual relationship with a company who historically were excluded from any kind of governance relationship with the company because they were not financial investors. That's the key message that I'll pause on.
Absolutely. I agree. I agree. It's definitely an advance in the process of getting stakeholders to be involved in the process. And I think it comes in addition, because we're talking about structure versus individuals, right? And this structure certainly improves the way in which individuals interact with others. Nothing will guarantee it.
Exactly. Yes.
Because if the heir to the big wealth that created a company, but also has other stakeholders, right, having a voice, if that person does not agree with it, finally you will end up in courts.
Mm. Yes.
Simple as that. And that contract becomes the same thing as another type of contract or another type of thing. But again, you see, maybe it's not that silly. No, it is silly to say the other exact. No, I think, when at Soul courses, we talk about concept of trust. First of all, we don't define trust, or at Soul, we don't define anything. We ask people to come up with a common language around concept. So in order to discuss trust, we asked people, think of a person or a situation where trust was present. How did it look like?
Mm.
And people will tell you. And if you put 15 opinions like that, it becomes a clear expression of what trust looks like, right? Because you have 15 experiences of 3, 4 cases. That's a lot of good data on how you look at trust. But then we ask them also, now tell us in those situations, what is it that generated trust? So what were the conditions in which trust was created? And people will come up with a number of things. If you put those two things together, how does it look like and how does it become a reality? Then people have found their solution for generating trust in their organization. Okay? Now, when we look at everything we hear and learn from that, there are literally hundreds of ways by which trust can be generated. One of them is transparency. The other one is love. The other one is respect. And some of them said it should be clear. In other words, writing it down becomes an important part of generating trust, or actually perpetuating trust. So I do agree also that if we are looking for new structures, definitely the participation structure, the structure in which participation is enhanced is a big advance. It's a big advance.
Yes.
Without, I mean, it has, as a big advance, it has its benefits, etc. Will not resolve all our problems. So the interesting thing would be, okay, we look at this, and then we also, probably an interesting conversation after that is, once you have that in place, what do you do in order to improve that process? Because the process in itself is not an end. Process is the beginning of something that you would like to enrich as time goes by.
I do completely agree with you. This is absolutely not saying this will solve everything. Do it once and it fixes everything. This is more a case of, in the world we're living in, to get to something that will steadily improve, it's essential to include in trust building interactions all of the people that are affected by the operations of each individual company. And the current way of structuring is too much dependent on what is initially agreed rather than on what is initially agreed between the founders and the investors, rather than on a dynamic, evolving relationship. And for me, it's very much anchored in what you said at the beginning. If we truly want to express the inherent nobility of all human beings, what will enable that to be expressed, and in particular to be expressed in such a way that can then lead to the kind of economy we need and the kind of society we need?
Totally agree.
Wonderful. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Mahmud, and I've really enjoyed working with your questions and the concerns and the doubts you have. and looking at what I'm saying through your eyes so that I can begin to see it more clearly myself. I found that very valuable and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Me too. Plenty of notes, as I said, and reflections and ideas to continue.
Wonderful,
Thank you, dear.
Mahmoud.
Have a nice day.
Beautiful. And you. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, welcome, dear. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.